So welcome everyone to this edition of our Meet the Author series. My name is Nathan Alexander. I'm the project manager with the Nonreligion in a Complex Future project. And today we're going to be hearing from Masoumeh Sara Rahmani and Peter Adds about their recent article, Māori Atheism, a Decolonizing Project. And before we begin, I wanted to do a brief Indigenous affirmation or land acknowledgement. The Nonreligion in a Complex Future project is based at the University of Ottawa in Ottawa, Canada. Please join us as we pay respect to the Algonquin people who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their longstanding relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. So now I'm going to introduce our two speakers. Dr. Masoumeh Sara Rahmani is a senior lecturer in the study of religion at Te Herenga Waka, Victoria University of Wellington. Her research focuses on atheism, non-religion, and deconversion, explored in relation to Buddhist meditation movements, and more recently, within the Māori cultural context. Sarah's recent monograph, Drifting Through Samsara, examined patterns of conversion and deconversion from Goenka's Vipassana movement in Aotearoa, or New Zealand. She's currently co-authoring her second book, Māori Atheism as a Decolonizing Project, with Professor Peter Adds and Dr. Geoff Troughton. And our second speaker, Professor Peter Adds, is an academic in the School of Māori Studies at Victoria University of Wellington. His academic training is in archaeology, but he has spent a large part of his career involved in Aotearoa-New Zealand's Treaty of Waitangi related work, including leading a land claim against the New Zealand government for the tribes of his own people in the Taranaki region of Aotearoa, New Zealand. This resulted in a large claim settlement in 2014. He teaches courses on Pacific and New Zealand prehistory, Māori customary concepts, issues in contemporary Māori society, and various courses on the history of the Treaty of Waitangi. And he has worked at Victoria for over 40 years. So now we'll have a presentation from the authors, and then we'll have a Q&A from the audience for the rest of the time. So Sarah and Peter, take it away.
Right, thank you for that. There, just let me know if you see it. Yeah?
Yep, perfect.
Okay, so I'm going to minimize everything else. Here we go. So I first want to acknowledge our third author, Rebecca Senanayake, who joined the team as a RA and actually helped us set up this project, doing literature review, and conducted the first 4 interviews. And obviously, since this is a Meet the Author, she should definitely be acknowledged. And our other colleague, Geoff Troughton, who joined the team later on as an expert on history of Christianity in Aotearoa, when we expanded this project into the Explaining Atheism program. So one of the reasons that we've been lucky to look at this project and expand it and so much is the rising number of Indigenous people identifying with no religion on census. Now, these are the statistics from 2023 census, which was published earlier this week, especially with relation to ethnicity. And you can see 60%, nearly 60% of Māori are claiming to have no religion, which is above the national averages. And this is a very conservative reading of the data. Another colleague of ours from Otago, Dean Galbraith, came up with a much larger percentage, around 65% of Māori identifying with no religion. And so you can see the same phenomena is happening in Australia and Canada. And that coincides with a decline of number of people identifying with Christianity. So we are curious to understand what's going on. And in the article that hopefully some of you have read, I feel like doing tutorials all over. In that article, we look at the contours of atheism, the different positionalities, experiences, and how these stories are articulated. And so I'm going to look at some of that, but really the bigger picture of our project looks at the factors contributing to this rise of non-religion. And so what I want to really focus in this particular talk is the centrality of the theme of coloniality of religion to the narratives of our participants. Our argument is quite simple here. It's that for Māori, atheism isn't just about disbelief. It's much more a political resistance against colonial oppression. And that's also just not a symbolic act. Most of our participants are activists in some form or another, and that takes different shades. We are also going to show you through using example how the values, their values align with the Māori rights movement, indigenous rights movement, and the colonial feminist movements. And lastly, what I would like to point to is that unlike what's implied in academia, this kind of decolonial project that we're calling doesn't necessarily mean a return to pre-colonial beliefs at all. And we can discuss this in a lot more depth in the Q&A. But first, I'm going to hand it over to Professor Adds, who's going to teach us about the history. And that's going to make all of this, all the narratives of the participants make a lot more sense.
Kia ora, thank you, Sarah. So, ko te mea tuatahi, aku me kia koutou, ko hara mai ki tā tātou hi tēnei rā. That's a Māori customary greeting, just really saying hello to you all and saying it's very nice to meet you. So, so what are Māori people decolonizing from? So I've been given a rather ambitious 15-minute slot to try and get through, provide you with an overview of the colonial period of New Zealand's history. I was going to start at 1814 with the arrival of missionaries in this country. But of course, by 1814, there'd already been quite a long history, actually, of European intervention, shall we call it, in this country. That started initially in 1642 with the arrival of a Dutch explorer by the name of Tasman, but really picked up with the arrival of Captain Cook in 1769 in this country. And when Cook arrived here, he changed everything, changed Māori worldview, substantially changed with the arrival of Cook. And as more explorers arrived in this country, that picked up pace. And by the time the missionaries arrived here, Anglican missionaries in 1814, 4 of them, under the leadership of one Samuel Marsden from Australia, from Sydney in Australia, there had already been substantial change in the Māori world. And of course, the missionaries played a significant role in accelerating that change, and due to the usual things that they do in the colonial process. By the 1830s, there was indeed extensive so-called conversion to Christianity. That wasn't a straightforward process. That was more often, rather than a straight conversion, a blending of Māori traditional religion and some aspects of Christianity. All that was going on in a period of turmoil, actually, in this country for Māori people, because one of the things that European settlers brought to this country, amongst other things, was the musket. And when Māori people acquired muskets, it really accelerated tension between Māori communities all over New Zealand. And a series of wars between Māori people started with the acquisition of those muskets. And to their credit, the missionaries were involved in, to some extent, trying to stop that warring between Māori groups, although there are allegations that some of the missionaries also traded muskets, of course. By the 1830s, New Zealand had become a hotbed, actually, of hostility by that time, and to the extent that some Māori people were even writing to the King of England by 1831, asking the king to intervene in this country and control his people. The king even replied to the letter, actually, suggesting that he might indeed protect Māori people and protect them from the French as well, but that he would also become potentially the father of the Māori people, as it's been interpreted by some Māori people today. And this was all in the context in Britain at that time of a developing humanitarian movement that I'm sure many of you will be aware of. And as a result, the Colonial Office in England decided to appoint a Crown official to this country in 1832. That person arrived in 1833, one James Busby. The name of the job was the official British resident in New Zealand, and his job was supposed to be about looking after Britain's interests in respect of this country, but actually he ended up looking after Māori interests, which did not make the Colonial Office happy initially. Amongst other things, he designed a flag for the Māori people of New Zealand, created a confederation of united tribes, as it was described, basically led a process which had Māori people declaring their independence over this country, their sovereignty over New Zealand. And somewhat weirdly, in the history of British imperialism and colonial expansion, the Colonial Office recognised that as a legitimate expression of Māori sovereignty. That document that was actually crafted by Busby is often referred to as the Declaration of Independence of New Zealand, He Whakaputanga in Māori, and it's a significant constitutional document for us today for the fact that sovereignty was recognised by the British, explicitly recognised. By the mid-1830s, a company had been formed in Britain that promoted the systematic colonisation of this country. Of course, in the context of this country and other British colonies, that was left largely to private enterprise. And by 1839, that company had actually arrived in New Zealand, had started so-called land buying from Māori people, and that resulted eventually by the Colonial Office, in fact, deciding that they needed to stop the company because of the whole humanitarian movement, because they could see that the company was about to rip Māori people off. And they decided to have a formal intervention, and they decided to do that by claiming sovereignty over New Zealand. To do that, of course, they had to take it from Māori because they'd recognised it 5 years earlier in 1835. If they're going to do this, however, they're going to do it ethically, they claimed. And they decided that they would do the ethical thing through a process of asking Māori people if they agreed with that, and that would be done through a treaty process. So a treaty was drafted between Māori and the British Crown. That document, which is on your screen now, of course, becomes, as some of you will know already, I'm sure, the focus of much turmoil in this country today, mainly because it was drafted by the British, initially in English and then translated into Māori by the missionary Henry Williams. And there are significant differences between the English version and the Māori version. In summary, the main difference is that the English version of the treaty has Māori people signing away their sovereignty to the Queen. The Māori version of the document does exactly the opposite. That has Māori people retaining their sovereignty. And the question around all those issues is, could Māori people read and write English in 1839? And the consensus amongst scholars today is that that would have been very limited, if any people could do that at all. So in fact, constitutional lawyers in this country regard the English version of that document as being invalid, in fact, because the 39 people that signed it almost certainly wouldn't have understood what they were signing, which leaves the Māori versions of the document, in fact, the valid documents. The documents are signed. The Crown then attempts to set up an administration in this country, believing that it now has the authority and the permission that it needed to start controlling the nation. Māori, of course, because of the Māori version that they'd signed, thought that they were now going to continue running the country. So this document, amongst other things, created completely different expectations between, well, if we can call them the treaty partners, about the future constitutional arrangements of this country. When the Crown realised that Māori people had no intention of giving up their sovereignty, they strategised to try and change that. They thought they would try and do that through policy initially. Those policies all failed. That was a policy system all about trying to induce in Māori communities the acceptance of a British style of law in this country so that the Crown could take over. All that policy making failed. When that failed, a war was started against Māori people, arguably as early as 1845, but certainly by 1860. And that's a war that lasted a long, long time. It was between imperial troops shipped out to this country via Australia for the most part, mainly Irish and Scottish troops, all while there's significant immigration to this country by the company. So amongst other things, through the war, through the 1860s, the population dynamics changed quite radically. And sometime between 1855 and 1860, there are now more non-Māori people living in this country than Māori people. And of course, that's going to have a profound effect on the power relations between the two groups of people, and it's going to make it much easier for the Crown to assert its control over Māori people. Māori lost the war, is the short story in relation to that. That happened by at least 1881. But today, the rhetoric around that in this country and the national narrative would have us believe that Māori people willingly signed away their sovereignty in 1840 when the treaty was signed. The reality of that, actually, is that Māori people had their sovereignty beaten out of them through an act of warfare that was perpetrated against us deliberately for that reason. After 1881, a belief emerged in this country, in the European community, that there would be a natural resolution to the Māori problem, actually, that Māori people would eventually die out. And it started, amongst other things, an amazing period of the collection of Māori ethnographic material through the 1880s, the 1890s, and into the early 20th century. Māori were largely living out of sight, out of mind. And by the way, through all of this, the Māori population was declining through introduced European diseases. And by 1900, the population got perilously low. For Māori people. Some demographers suggest it may have got as low as 30,000 people. But by 1910, it had become, the population was increasing again. And of course, Māori participated in World War I, which I don't quite understand, to tell you the truth. Māori were desperate, like other New Zealanders at that time, to fight for Mother England, and many people suggest that that was about making a statement about equality in this country, that Māori were equal to non-Europeans, non-Māori people rather, and that they could also contribute to a world war. Same thing happened again in World War II. Māori committed in World War II and died in their droves in World War II, assisting our government to beat Nazi Germany, I suppose. By the 1970s in this country, we'd seen the government come up with various policies about the state of race relations in this country, asserting to the rest of the world, in fact, that New Zealand was the one place on the planet where racial harmony prevailed through the 1950s and the 1960s. The reality about that was that there was indeed deeply entrenched racism in this country, but the government was able to make that outrageous claim quite simply because the two populations essentially lived apart. Māori were effectively out of sight, out of mind through that period of our history, and continued through all of this stuff to rely on the Treaty of Waitangi that signed in 1840 for some sense of justice and equality in this country. That picked up markedly in the 1970s in this country with the formation of Māori political activists and activist groups in this country. A number of them were formed suddenly in that year. These groups were in your face, and they were very much into blaming the New Zealand establishment and the government in particular for what they perceived to be the ills of Māoridom. And when that happened, middle non-Māori New Zealand, Pākehā New Zealand as we call it, started to worry about the state of our nation and started to wonder whether we did in fact have some racial issues in this country. And that became really evident in the early 1970s. The government reacted to that situation by trying to control that perception by creating an organization in 1975 to try and pacify Māori, an organization called the Waitangi Tribunal, created in that year, to allow Māori people to have a forum to make claims against the government about that colonial history that had been perpetrated against them. One of the jobs of that Waitangi tribunal was to define treaty principles in this country. The notion of treaty principles is still well and truly with us in this country today. Treaty principles, the idea of treaty principles comes from the realization only in the 1970s that the two versions of the treaty documents, the English version and the Māori version, say such different things around the sovereignty issue in this country, who would be running New Zealand, that you can't possibly use the documents themselves to forge a relationship between the treaty partners. What you should do instead, some clever lawyers said in the 1970s, was you should look at the principles that underlie the documents, the spirit of the documents, as it was sometimes described. What were the authors of the documents writing about, rather than what they actually said, pieces of paper. So this notion of treaty principles is everywhere in New Zealand today, but of course to have treaty principles at all is to rely on the invalid English version of the treaty. That's come to a head recently in our country, in our current government, with one of our coalition partners putting through what's referred to as a treaty principles bill, which is all about confining and defining the principles of the treaty in legislation to one tightly defined set of understandings, all of which are taken from the invalid English version of the treaty document. And that's creating consternation in this country, certainly in the Māori community, but beyond as well. And we've just recently had a submission process on that particular bill, a record number of submissions in this country protesting about that particular bill, 300 submissions on that particular bill. And that gives us an indication of the depth of feeling out there amongst New Zealanders about what they consider the right thing to be done in respect of that legislation, basically it's to sink it. But it remains to be seen whether that will actually happen. If that bill did go through, there's no shortage of capacity in this country for civil disobedience. And some of us think that that the only way through this eventually is to have a constitutional discussion that will basically rid us of our colonial history, that will allow us to create a new style of government that really reflects what the treaty originally envisaged, and maybe encapsulate the notion of partnership a bit better than it has so far. So look, I'll stop there because my time's up. In fact, I'm over time. So I'm happy to take questions about this later. That's a once over lightly for our colonial history.
All right, thank you so much, Peter. So what I want to do is now turn to our participants and give you a picture of what their world and thinking is. I'm not going to get too much detail with method. Happy to discuss that in the Q&A. Just to say that it was in-depth interviews, and we recruited participants through our connections with the Aotearoa community, as well as drawing some help from our connections with Māori cultural content creators on TikTok specifically, as well as snowball sampling, of course. So here you have a little bit of detail about our participants. What I want to highlight here is that the occupations are just alphabetic order. And also what I want to point out is the religious upbringing. 8 of our 35 participants were raised in non-religious households, but the rest, I would describe it as moderate to high exposure to religion and socialization. And when I say high, I really mean that, having parents who are ministers, vicars, and so on. Okay, so here, our article really gets into the details around the different positionalities, the contours of atheism. So again, I don't want to be reiterating all of that, but to just show you that there was representation across these categories. So the 22 atheists that I'm kind of capturing in this pie chart, I'm collapsing both positive atheists and negative atheists. The difference was, one of the fascinating parts were that those who whose outlooks and values and commitments kind of matched the negative atheist outlook, used this argument around pushing for a metaphorical reinterpretation of concepts in Te Māori, kind of saying that actually, if you look at it that way, it fits perfectly within the scientific framework. What else I want to say is that our participants were calling agnostic here. In the article, we use uncertain unbelief for that category. And so their outlooks, whilst they were kind of at the baseline, everybody agreed that atheism means the rejection of a Christian God, a theistic God. Those who had certain agnosticism, those really concerned ambivalence around some supernatural Māori concepts rather than anything to do with theism. So that's something that I really want to emphasize. So if there are any kind of ambivalence, it's not with the rejection of their sort of Christian theistic God. Okay, so let's jump into our main kind of theme here. So 25 out of the 35 participants brought up the topic of colonialism in one way or another. For 18 people, it was the anchor point against which they would form their story and rationale about why they are atheists and why they've rejected Christianity. And you can see somebody like Aroha here, who would say, if there are no other reason, this would be the reason. So this critique is usually very sharp, specifically looking at Christianity and the history of Christian mission in Aotearoa. And in fact, the category or the label religion was rarely kind of used as a category. It was always very specifically meaning Christianity. Now, and obviously the critique here is that Christianity was used as a tool to against Māori culture and language and people. Another way that this idea was articulated, which I found quite fascinating and empowering, is an example I'm using here by Ari, who essentially renders Christianity irrelevant for Māori and Indigenous people by kind of localizing it somewhere else. It's a religion for people in the Middle East. It's quite irrelevant to us. We have our own history. We have our own culture and our own gods and whatnot. And that's not to say everybody used this kind of reasoning. Amongst the people who didn't bring up colonialism, one participant particularly emphasized this need to sort of abandon or avoid using these discourses that valorize victimhood. And these kind of people also kind of focus their narratives, first of all, using secular sort of humanist morality, rationality, those kind of discursive frameworks for explaining their positionality, but also critique Māori who were Christian for sort of Trojan horsing Christianity into secular spheres. So I'm just trying to kind of show you the full spectrum of positions on when this idea comes up and what happens when it doesn't. So one of the fascinating things for us in particular is just looking further into that coloniality of religion is this perceived tension between the Māori and Christian sort of worlds or identities. And you can see an example that I'm using here is of River, who is arguing whether the Māori identity and Christian belief could even coexist given this history. Like, as in, how could you still go on and be part of this if you know what has happened to our people? But ironically, this wasn't just unique to the atheist or non-religious participants. We could also see it come up. This tension was coming up in the narrative or language of our participants who did identify as Christian. And the example I'm using here is of Ika, who is locating that tension within the church, saying the church says you can be Christian, you can't be Māori. You have to choose. You can only be Christian, and kind of arguing that they're failing to see what they mean by Christian is being Pākehā, being white. When this tension came up, usually participants resolved it through sort of a theological discourse, talking about hope, talk about Jesus, what have you. But I just thought it's quite fascinating because the assumption would always be that it's the atheists who see this these two worlds as incompatible. Okay, so back to one of our most important points, and that is this critique is not merely about some historical process. Rather, participants see them as pervasive, ongoing, and tacit. Here you have 3 different quotes. You have Kakariki, who's saying, you know, it seems logical to me that we should take the churches to court, given the continued sort of perpetuation of anti-Indigenous agenda, their role in that. Or Aroha again, who is kind of saying, well, churches are being quite sneaky and they kind of building them right next to the marae, and it just feels like this silent takeover continues. And so these are examples from people who directly brought up this idea, right? But in the instances that coloniality wasn't directly addressed, participants still gave us statistics on Māori health, Māori incarceration rates, on poverty rates, they talked about generational trauma, they talked about loss of language and culture. They were quite annoyed by the fact that they had to pay to learn te reo, and the overall experience of living in New Zealand within a kind of predominantly white society. So there was a lot of examples of racism as well. And in these themes, our research isn't kind of unique. The study by Dina Abbott and her colleague Melanie Brewster also points to the similar kind of themes, where she looks at non-religion within marginalized communities in the US. But also our colleague Jonathan Simmons found similar kind of critique within the language and discourse of Indigenous atheists in Canada. And we're actually very excited to be collaborating with Jonathan soon. So now that I've been centralizing all of that, I want to kind of take a step back and say that aside from that obvious theme of coloniality, the language, the stories are consistent with the concerns of atheists that we hear about in other contexts, specifically in terms of intellectual doubt, rejecting the religion on the accounts of intellectual doubt, or other forms of moral criticism, be it religious hypocrisy, religious exclusivism, bigotry, or even environmental concerns. But what we still found is that for some of those themes, still it's undergirded by the same sort of critique of coloniality. So for instance, saying Christian worldview is destroying the environment, or it's responsible for all the socially harmful views against women, the rainbow community, etc., and so on. So still underneath all of that, there is that kind of thread. Okay, how much time do I have? I just want to say a couple of points here. And really that's about showing the other side of the picture, which is it's not, even though coloniality is quite highlighted here, I don't want to downplay at the same time the influence of other secular or discursive frameworks. Here I'm using an example which I think captures all of that point. Hemi, who is saying that I decided that if I want to be intellectually honest and consistent, I should also analyze my beliefs and put them on the table the same way that I'm sort of approaching Christian beliefs. And one final point is that what I'm using this quote is to kind of show how those values align with the Māori protest movements and decolonial feminist movements that Peter was talking about earlier on. So you can see here, he's kind of saying part of me clinging to my Māori culture at the beginning, at that process of rejecting Christianity, kind of immersing into Te Māori a little bit, and then kind of moving out and saying, part of that was kind of saying that's not our stuff, and then, you know, getting into Māori rights and all sorts of things, kind of getting our land back. So, you know, those topics that you were discussing is quite evident here. And more to the point is that these are not just symbolic positions. People like Hemi actually go out in the world, they're doing the work. The rest of the same kind of interview, he kind of notes that that developed into a bigger idea of trying to promote critical thinking, especially within Māori communities, and that became the overarching kaupapa principle for what he does. And like, for instance, this is a teacher, right? And to say that actually that activism comes in lots of different shades. Here we have a famous musician, also a content creator, who, you know, gave me that same reasoning of why am I doing this? Why am I putting some time? Is to promote Te Māori, is to kind of help my own people get out of that grip of colonization. I think I'm going to end here on this one, which is to say, sometimes that decolonial activism may entail a sort of return to pre-colonial narratives and concepts and epistemologies, but most often it's not. And that was the argument that I put forward, or maybe I'll end here. The best case and point, which is the Aotearoa community of Māori atheists and freethinkers who are quite active. They have media appearances, they do interviews, publish a book. And that just perfectly captures that political and activist dimension of these narratives. Our slides were designed by River, and I think I'm going to end it there. Thank you. Happy to take all sorts of questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Sarah and Peter. That was great. So let's open it up for questions. So you can either raise your hand via Zoom, or you can write your question in the chat and I can read it. Any questions? I can start while other people think of their questions. My question, I guess, I mean, I have many questions I wanted to ask, but one is, well, what do we know about like Maori beliefs before the arrival of Europeans? And yeah, like, and how, you know, some percentage of your participants like indicated like a Maori spiritual beliefs. So I wonder like how, well, what do we know about the pre-colonial beliefs? And then like, what does Maori spirituality or beliefs look like today? Is it the same or is that different?
The traditional pre-European belief system's reasonably well known. The missionaries, apart from anything else, kept really good records of what they were observing, not so they could preserve it, of course, but so they could change it. So we've got that record. But there's also a huge amount of European ethnography on it as well, when there was a realization that Māori culture might disappear by the 1880s, the 1890s. Ethnographers went to extraordinary lengths to record what they could about existing traditional Māori religion at that time. Of course, a lot of that by then, or some of that by then, had been impacted by the advent of Christianity in many Māori communities actually, but there was enough of the traditional system because it was a blending. There was syncretic religions formed in this country. But even today, Māori traditional religion still exists in, I wouldn't say it's an uncontaminated form, but it's still present out there, and the blending is still very evident actually. So if you go to a Māori function today, say if you go to a Māori funeral or something like that, it's really common to see, well, the clergy will be present, in their regalia typically. They'll do their thing as part of the ceremonial of the occasion. But mixed in with all that stuff is still the traditional Māori religious belief as well. All the tapu stuff is still there. All the mana games are still going on. All those traditional Māori conceptual things are still present in the meeting space, all mixed in and blended with some Christian stuff. My assessment of that is that the Christian part of that would probably be in decline. Would be my assessment of it, actually, and that the traditional Māori religious stuff is making a comeback, which sort of fits with what we already know about the whole atheist thing. I could describe the nature of traditional Māori religion if you were interested, but yeah.
Yeah,
do you want me to or not?
Yeah,
please.
Yeah,
okay.
please.
Well, so it's polytheistic, obviously. So belief in around, depending on who you read, about 70 traditional Māori gods, each of them responsible for some department of life and or the natural world, all descended from two primal gods, Ranginui, the so-called Sky Father, Papatuanuku, the Earth Mother, and their children. And the Māori creation story actually involves those gods being locked in what's described as an embrace, with the children locked in between the parents, the children eager to escape, and do eventually escape, actually, and take over the running of various departments of the world of light. So Tane becomes the god of the forests, Tangaroa becomes the god of the sea, and about 68 others of them, all responsible for different things, including the god of people, one Tu Mātoenga, who's the brother of those gods. And so people, therefore, are inextricably linked to the natural world. They are, in fact, a part of the natural world. And Māori would say, well, they'd go as far as saying that there's actually a biological connection between people and the natural world. Yeah, and that religious belief, of course, was incorporated into virtually every aspect of daily life. It wasn't reserved for Sundays or anything like that. It was everywhere all the time.
All right. Okay, great. Thank you. Lauren, you've got a question.
I do. Thank you. Let me turn on my video. Hi, thank you. I have a question that arose while reading the article about science. It's mentioned several times throughout the article, and I was wondering if either your participants or maybe in New Zealand more broadly, there's any talk about Indigenous science or Maori science right now. It's something we're seeing in Canada and the United States. And one of the reasons I thought of it is I love this part in the article where it talks about like Trojan horsing and Christianity through the guise of Maori tradition. And there's some, maybe not so much like debate, but perhaps tension I see here between tradition and science, in the sense that Indigenous knowledge traditions don't need to look like Western science in order to be legitimate. But then maybe calling them tradition instead of science in certain contexts works to devalue it. I saw a media headline recently about whether Indigenous science and Western science can work together. So I was just wondering if that kind of distinction between maybe like a Western or colonial science versus Indigenous science is something that came up at all.
Yes, that's a great, brilliant question. And it does come up because, again, you can see how different groups of participants actually bring it up, or whether it's all they address it, or how they resolve it. So amongst the participants who I would say their perspectives kind of aligns with a positive outlook, a positive atheist outlook. So I don't believe in God, but I also don't believe in any supernatural phenomena. Those participants would kind of just say, you know, they would be much more rigid with these epistemologies, wanting to differentiate them, kind of saying, being quite vocal. I would say Aotearoa community might be quite vocal around that. Some people would be in that community to say this is not science. But whereas our participants who we kind of use the negative atheist category for them, they would want to reinterpret that through a metaphoric sense and say, actually, this fits perfectly with science, right? They'll give us an example of how Māori culture, or from the Māori perspective, the tree has personhood, ocean has personhood, and if you kind of look at it metaphorically, you know, it would make sense. One other example that kind of stuck with me was a woman kind of giving me example of how, you know, when a woman is pregnant with a baby girl, the eggs of that baby girl is already in, you know, the the eggs are, you know, you're born with them,
I know what
right?
you're referring
And so
to,
they're
yeah.
using that example to kind of talk about how Māori understand whakapapa and interconnectedness. So, you know, you'll have people who would outright reject it. You'll have people who reinterpret it and say, actually, this works. And then you'll have people who, you know, use that Trojan horsing and kind of, you know, for them, it would be a very contested thing as well, saying there needs to be quite a separation here. And of course, people who are lean more into spirituality would kind of want to give that more prominence. Yes, it's like there's a whole diversity. And maybe one thing that I should emphasize here is that the atheist we're talking about here grew up within Christian households, right? So that atheism is kind of positioned against that as religion. And so for a lot of people, there is this trajectory of leaving Christianity, learning, immersing themselves in Te Ao Māori, learning about it. And some people would kind of come out of that and say, this is also religious to me, like the example of Hemi. Some people would kind of be like, you know, I might need to reinterpret this within a different approach. Does that answer your question?
No, it does. Thank you very much.
Okay, we've got a few questions in the chat that I'll read. So the first one is from Renata. She says, thank you for the talk. It sparked connections for me to Brazilian colonial history. And she's sorry for the clarification, but she's arrived a little bit late. She said, I would like to know whether the actors call themselves atheists, and if what they refer to as atheism is their rejection of religious convention due to its association with colonial history. Thank you.
Yes. So we've had quite a few of kind of public outreach, and the comment that keeps coming back and haunting me is, why are you calling us atheists? And it's like, well, the participants said, you know, that's how they self-identify. Yeah. And so yes, and it's usually kind of against the rejection of that kind of coloniality of religion. That was a quite straightforward question. Shall we move to the next?
Yeah, that sounds good. Yes. So next one from Jacek. Apologies if I've got your name wrong. How long has such a high percentage of people without a declared religious affiliation been appearing in surveys? I ask because there's no previous studies on this topic.
That's a great question. I think we have the stat somewhere of looking at that increase, and I think we can see it from 2006, and at a steady rate, 1% per year going up. But over the last two censuses, it's just kind of exceeded the national average. Yeah.
Right. Okay, great. Right, and moving on to the next question. There's a question from Patience. I have a question about Maori non-religion and atheism. Would you say that disbelief among Maori is more about rejecting religion as a whole, or is it more focused on rejecting the religions imposed on Maori historically? Also, do you think people who practice Maori spirituality or other religions like Buddhism are sometimes perceived as non-religious among Maori Christians because atheism and disbelief are often framed as a rejection of Christianity specifically?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Peter, do you want to take the first one?
Which is what? That
I can read it again.
For some of our participants, I think it is about rejecting religion as a whole. That'd be the positive atheists, I would say. I think roughly 10% of our sample, more or less in that category. But then there's a whole other big tranche of people out there that would say, yes, I'm an atheist, but actually I still believe in Māori spirituality, and I still practice some aspects of Māori traditional religion. but not in an organized sense, and certainly not in sort of any Christian framework as such, you know.
And so do you think that people who practice Maori spirituality and non-formal religion sometimes perceived as non-religious by Maori? I don't have much data to be able to answer that. I've only spoken with 3 or 4 Christian Maori, so I don't think I have a good grasp on their sort of approach.
Anecdotally, I would say no. I would say that the data that we've got from the census is all self-declaration, of course. So it's not about perception by others. It's how people perceive themselves. But my perception of that is that if a Māori person is declaring themselves to be a Buddhist, then they're perceived to be religious rather than non-religious, is I think how most of my relations anyway would see it that way, I think. Yeah.
All right. Okay, thank you. Laurie, did you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thanks so much. This is fascinating. In Canada, we're aware of Jonathan's research, and I think he's pretty much the only person who's doing research like yours. So it's quite rare and really interesting. I'm curious about a couple of things, and I think you may have already partially answered my first question. That is, how do Maori themselves react when you talk about Maori atheism? Because sometimes there's a sort of pressure to think about at least indigenous spirituality. And that leads to my other question, and that is, I guess, around the conflation of indigenous knowledge and indigenous spirituality. And that here I use the word indigenous thinking more broadly to asking, because I know you're working with Jonathan, to think more broadly about the ways in which, especially around the natural world and other human relations with other than humans, there's a tendency to sort of want to characterize indigenous knowledge as indigenous spirituality or religion. So I'm just curious about that and your reflections on that, given the expertise you have and the research that you've been doing.
I'll take the first one, which I would say to that a lot of our participants actually talk about experiencing some form of discrimination for kind of their non-belief or atheism, and that can come in lots of extreme shades of kind of, you're not a Māori if you are atheist. And Jonathan's research also points to the same sort of thing. And so I think that should explain straightforward that question. So there is a lot of discrimination that they're faced with. Yeah.
But when I talk about this stuff with lots of my students, for example, there's genuine interest amongst my students about this whole issue, and it causes them to reflect. Maybe I'm one of those as well, you know. So you know, I think there's a sort of a general acceptance maybe in the Māori community and flexibility around these sorts of ideas. Certainly with the young people that I'm interacting with quite a lot in our university. There might be an older generation of Māori people perhaps that might be a bit more conservative around some of those issues, and might be a bit more hardcore Christian, shall we say. But I think that they're probably in a fairly fast shrinking minority in this country at the moment. Oh, I'm sorry, what was the second part of your question again, Laurie?
Sorry, really about the conflation of indigenous knowledge and indigenous spirituality and religion, and particularly around the natural world. Indigenous knowledge about the natural world and human, non-human animal relations is often characterized as spiritual when it maybe doesn't necessarily belong in that category.
Yeah, I think you're possibly right about that. I think our people tend to make a separation actually between those beliefs about the natural world and Christian belief about those sorts of issues. It's not often that you'll find, I think, Christian perspective in spirituality around certainly the natural world, but it would extend beyond the natural world would be my assessment of that. So they don't really blend in that way over those sorts of issues would be my thought about that.
we're really interested in frameworks. I'm going to sneak one more in. Frameworks of possibility and the ways in which unbelief, non-religion, that's our kind of thing, is possible, is even possible. And so it seems to me that perhaps Maori atheism, and from what you've said, is a little bit more difficult or a little bit more impossible. I was just speaking, Renata just asked a question. I was speaking with her on the weekend about the impossibility of atheism in Brazil for a variety of reasons. It's not that atheists don't exist in Brazil, but again, looking at the social frames that make something possible or impossible. And I just wondered if you've given thought to that in your research.
So this impossibility, I think I've also read it in the work of a colleague from India, who analyzed kind of like, as you're saying, that broader framework of how an atheist identity within this cultural location is kind of seen as like, well, that can't be because you ought to be spiritual person. And we analyze that in our article, kind of looking at it as one of the kind of, it's a colonial lens to begin with, right? And it's one of the reasons that is contributing to the stigma that is associated with being a non-religious Māori. But as Peter was saying, it's quite a demographic response. Like, because I read all the commentary underneath our social media posts, they really can change depending on which social media I'm reading. So if it's on Twitter, I'm sorry, X, it's really aggressive, brutally aggressive. But then when you look at the kind of public engagement with the same material on somewhere like TikTok, it's constantly like, oh my God, I can relate to this. I'm from Hawaii. I relate to this. This is exactly how it's going on for me in Tonga. This is, and as well in Aotearoa as well. So I feel like, yes, that thing is demographic and it's changing, but that the root cause of that is that colonial lens of kind of bracketing all Indigenous people within this idea that you are spiritual. Yeah, that's at the heart of it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Which hence the idea of impossibility.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. I just had one other really quick question. I don't know how quick it is really, but just because we got a late start. You mentioned that you're working on a book now about the same project, same topic. So maybe you could, if you could give us a preview of what you're working on the book.
Okay, so the book is kind of organizing all this research that we've been doing for 4 years into, a book. It will look at experiences, it will look at these narratives, but really the focus is going to be on factors that contribute to the rise of non-religion amongst Indigenous people. So that's the angle for the book. But what we're mostly excited about is collaborating with colleagues in Canada, Jonathan Simmons and Justin Tetrol. We're going to have a comparative sort of study looking at non-religion, so growing this project that we both did separately on atheism and growing it into like what is driving this rise in non-religion in both of our countries, and what are the bigger sort of historical, political, social sort of structures that is contributing to that. So that's what we're up to for the next 3 years. I'm very excited to.
All right, great. Yes, and we look forward to that when it comes out. I'm just including a link to our next event. This is in a few weeks, April 9th. This is the latest in our series of, it's called Non-Religion, Past and Present, Interdisciplinary Conversations. This one, we're bringing together historians and social scientists to talk about non-religion. And this one, we're focusing on statistics. How do different historians and social scientists use statistics to study non-religion? I also included a link to a new episode of our podcast called the Life Stances Podcast. This is about people's experience hiking and trekking and so on, how this shapes their worldviews and their life stances. And finally, I included a link to our mailing list. If you're not on our mailing list and would like to get updates on our future events and research, please sign up. With that, thanks once again, Peter and Sarah. This was a really great presentation and a really great discussion afterwards. So thank you.
Thank you for
Thank
having
you.
us.
Thank you.
And thanks for everyone for coming and for your questions.